And this is about a 40-minute talk, I think. So we're going to have some time for Q&A as well. I'm of course, I already know what I know. I'm super interested in what you guys think about all of this. But I'll try to give you kind of a grand tour of how we see all this evolving, a little bit more detail. So there might be some overlap with the very quick intro video that I submitted. So let's move ahead here. Okay, so if you are a founder, or if you are running a larger company, or investing in a larger company, or you're a founder thinking of how to disrupt industry incumbents, you are probably going to be thinking a great deal about how to apply exponential technologies and impact a variety of industries. And virtually every industry now is being remade because of some disruptive technology that's being applied in a business model that's changing the assumptions around how that business works. So we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. Now, we think part of what's going on is that there's a cycle where investors are allocating capital to ventures that are developing and deploying these exponential technologies. And that results in industry disruption and also some amount of social upheaval. And as this takes effect, though, there are obvious advantages to be had in terms of capital efficiency, and that creates incentive and frees up more capital for investing further in developing and deploying these technologies. There is also a counter cycle, and so we've talked a little bit about the impact of protectionism in our work, both in the US and also in the EU, where you now see digital protectionism to keep disruptors from Silicon Valley out to the large tech companies. That's never really worked too well in the long run in practice, and you can't really hold innovation back and disruption back for very long, because people have free will. So unless you put them in prison, they're going to keep innovating. But you see a delay factor in different industries. The more regularly they are, the slower the pace of innovation. And that's just part of the landscape that we have to understand. So I removed the video here, but there's plenty of examples of, for example, of Uber drivers, of taxi drivers protesting against Uber. I think this clip is from a protest in Paris 3 or 4 years ago. And we have a lot of examples of this, and then people are upset because they feel like the rules are changing, it's unfair somehow, and there are people who feel left behind by technology disruption. If you work in the fast food business, pretty soon they're going to be replaced by robots making hamburgers, and there are a lot of people who are in the short term are going to feel negative consequences of this, but all of us as a whole are going to enjoy better and longer lives as a result of technological innovation. So let's keep that in mind. One of the things that's really changing, and I think this partly is generational, is that millennials and post-millennials and their attitude about what work is supposed to be about is changing. And so they see themselves more as empowered by technology, and the old sort of Marxist, workers versus capitalists, or workers versus owners. That whole mindset, I think, is going to increasingly give way to this view of people seeing themselves as technology-empowered makers, and they can be creators, they can be owners of their own companies. There's a whole wave of entrepreneurialism happening, not just in Silicon Valley, but in hubs all over the world, which I think is very exciting, not just from a business perspective, but from a cultural perspective. You don't need to go work for a company for 10 years and slowly climb the ladder, and you can team up with your friends and start your own adventure. And now I think there's now 50 million people around the world who view themselves as content creators in some fashion, whether it's graphics design or animation, or they're podcasters or freelance writers or app developers, and venture capitalists have now started referring to these folks as the creator economy. And so if you look at platforms like Substack, they're capitalizing on people who can build an audience and make a living just from their ability to create useful new content. So now, even in kind of traditional jobs, we see employee tenures going down a little bit. And of course, if you look at startups, the average employee tenure in Silicon Valley, last time we checked the metrics for this, was 10.8 months. 10.8 months, so less than a year. And even in large Silicon Valley tech companies, Apple and Facebook and so on, I think it's only about 2 years. And this is in part because companies go out of business. So you look at the average lifespan, or average age, I should say, of S&P 500 listed companies. It's going down. There's been a lot of work on shortening organizational lifespans and how that's related to technology disruption. It's also because people are themselves driven to, or required to, in order to have a career, to keep developing themselves. And if there's not much excitement within your company, you're going to go to where you can learn and do more. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. So now, on the production side, manufacturing has been a very important aspect of developing management thinking since the Second Industrial Revolution, starting with Taylorism and so on. And now we're seeing the beginning of decentralization in manufacturing. And so we call these microfactories, and Daimler is one company that's doing it. The military is doing it for 3D printing spare parts. There's another company that's a member of our post-industrial forum. It's called Bright Machines. So they focus on automated assembly, and so they can create these manufacturing lines with 3 or 4 of these units that look like the size of a fridge or so, and that's a tiny manufacturing line. And this could be on the floor in your apartment building, and so on. So it can be, you can imagine a world where that's emerging, where stuff that you buy will be produced in microfactories in your neighborhood. So we're not yet at the level of Star Trek replicators, but that's the direction that we're heading in. And basically supply chain economics is what's dictating shrinking the number of units or organizations in the supply chain to 1. So what's actually being transmitted is a software recipe for what it is that you want to buy or consume. Now, if we put these trends together, so we have exponential technology development, and then we have reduced tenures and organizational lifespans. We have decreasing layers of management in organizations. That's facilitated by IT, certainly. And we have centralized production starting to give way a little bit to decentralized production. And certainly the pandemic exposed a lot of supply chain problems. So that's another push. In fact, decentralization in general has been accelerated by the pandemic. We put all these together and we look at history of human cultures over time, which I spent a fair amount of time doing back in 2014-15. And we find that on the centralization side, we've been on a path of increasing centralization leading up to the industrial revolutions and beyond. And then when we got the commercial internet and we got smartphones, then we see a dramatic drop in centralization. So that's turned around, and now we have accelerating decentralization, both in terms of where people are working, so remote work, working from home. Again, the pandemic has accelerated this. Going to school remotely or over the internet, remote investing, people moving from cities out to the countryside, and because of being able to do things over the internet, they can now be more geographically dispersed. And then on the technology side, we made progress from inventing agriculture, developing in the Bronze Age, developing writing systems and the idea of written agreements and laws, court, lawyers, accounting. A lot of these constructs that organizations run on are quite old, and then since the 1970s, we've been really experiencing exponential progress in computing, storage, and communications capacity. Now, I say often to CEOs that if you want to imagine how technology can affect the culture, affect society, management books are not really the way to go. You should start reading more science fiction. So the first talk I gave on all of this, by the way, I said, welcome to half management science fiction. So that was back in 2015. And people sort of laughed uneasily, but now everyone can see how all of this is accelerating, including decentralization. So I stopped saying that. This is real management science now. But we can be inspired by science fiction. And this particular trilogy that was published back in 2003 or so, plus minus one year, it came out over a period of 3 or 4 years maybe. It describes a post-industrial civilization. And that's really the term that we use for this, because we think it's change on an anthropological level. And this civilization has attributes which are not surprising to us today. There are startups working on every one of these pieces. And what's kind of interesting to me is that this story is set 10,000 years into the future. So the future is really arriving way ahead of schedule. It's pretty difficult now to be a science fiction author, because you just whatever wild predictions you have, by the following spring, some startup is doing it. So of course we believe that we have to go not just beyond Taylorism, we have to go beyond the mainstream sort of models of management and practices of management today, because they're not really designed to cope with the world where all the premises behind the way we've been doing work the last several decades, really since the end of the 19th century, where all of those assumptions are being challenged. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, our mission at the Post-Industrial Institute is, of course, to develop new ideas and practices and tools for this. And so we look at this through a variety of lenses. We look at a variety of things. Most of my focus in this talk will be about the future of firms, but we're also quite interested in industrial policy and in the culture and society. And all these things, of course, are connected. Now, if we go back a little bit in management history, there's a classic paper called The Nature of the Firm, published in 1937 by Ronald Coase, a British microeconomist, in which he posits an upper practical limit for the size of firms, because as you get larger and larger, the cost of coordination goes up. He refers to it as a cost of management mistakes. So as an enterprise becomes too unwieldy, using lens, the transaction costs basically go down. And at the same time, there's a lower bound, because you're not going to start a whole company just to run your life. In spite of those books that you buy in the airport, or at least before the pandemic that we used to buy in the airport, that were called "You Are Your CEO" and so on. Now, of course, this has changed. So now you have huge enterprises like Walmart and Amazon that would have been impossible to scale and manage at that level without information technology. And at the same time, you really can be your own CEO by participating in freelancer platforms and so on. So technology has really changed a lot of the assumptions about both how large and how small firms can be and create value. Now, here's a dramatic example. So Marriott, 121,000 people. I just updated that slide, so that's a correct figure. Versus Airbnb, which is less than more than an order of magnitude less, fewer employees. And then think about, how about Instagram? So when they were acquired for $1 billion, they had 13 employees. So this idea that we have to have a lot of employees to create a lot of value, well, that's certainly no longer true. If you look at the market cap of Marriott and Airbnb, you also start thinking about how little time it's taken for Airbnb to acquire, to grow the amount of share value that they have. And it took Marriott a long time to get to that level. So what this means is that it's not just firms can be smaller, it's not just like they can be more valuable in relation to their size, it's also that they can be grown much faster. And so, of course, traditional enterprises are facing a very difficult situation here. Now, if you were to ask executives, and this has been done in surveys, how much at risk they are for being disrupted, then they pretty much all agree that at least there is a moderate risk, or more. So if you put these columns together in this survey, which is from CB Insights 2018, but these surveys basically all say roughly the same thing. And you find that there's not denial that disruption might happen, but if you look at how they actually invest innovation resources, well, most of it is on incremental innovation. Most of it is on what we might call sustaining development. And of course, agile fits comfortably in to this way of working, because it's there's a feedback cycle. You're trying to do things in small steps. You're trying to respond to what customers need. You have small ideas that you're trying to implement, but what you're not doing generally is building new products and services that are disruptive of how an industry works. And I think part of the reason for that is just the scope of stakeholders who are involved, and also it relates to organizational structure. So we'll talk a little bit more about that also. They're depressing lists, and this is just one of them. It's a little bit US centric, but lists of companies that did not transform, adapt quickly enough. Thomas Cook was a pretty high profile example over in Europe. Super Shuttle, I don't know, that sort of stung for me, because I don't know, I felt kind of sentimental about that company. I used to fly a lot more before the pandemic, like all of us. And I remember first time I came to the US, I was picked up in the Super Shuttle, and yeah, but they're all gone. I think dollar stores may still be around. I think they have kind of rebooted themselves, and some of these firms are just not coming back. So if we look at who does well, and their characteristics, and I'm really not talking about actions of the executive team, characteristics of the executive team of the board. What we see is that there's more awareness, there's more tech savvy. I mean, none of these attributes should surprise you. There's more curiosity. I do think that's a cultural attribute. If you don't have curiosity in the executive suite and in the boardroom, and you have people who would prefer that the world stay just the way it is, and that's not an age thing, guys. My dad's 85. He's still writing software, designing hardware. It's just a mindset. And a lot of industries, a lot of organizations do not promote people who are curious, who are creative. You are promoted because you make a promise, and there's a KPI, and you meet your promise. And then people say, well, he or she did what they said they were going to do. So we're going to trust them with more resources and more responsibility. Now, there's a very interesting piece of work that was done by a woman in London, who's also a speaker at the Post-Industrial Forum, Clara Turodier, on the composition of boards in publicly traded companies in the UK, the London Exchange. And she talks about how virtually none of them had a technology background, the directors in those boards. So that's a significant challenge. And so when you don't have these attributes, and you have the opposite composition, this is a factor, something you might recognize more easily. What you see is sort of this: they don't know what they don't know. They don't know anyone who can help them break out. And so this is a hard place to start from. And so, of course, what a lot of organizations are doing is they're appointing, chief digital officers, and often it's a CIO in the company that's expected now to bring technology into strategy and help transform But the transformation generally is too modest and it's too slow. So if we look at management premises versus new reality, you can see how Agile fits pretty comfortably in on the left-hand side, because that's where most management thinking has been. But the emerging reality, and in the previous version of this slide, by the way, the headlines here were lean and post-lean, because in the new reality that's emerging, what we see is more of an emphasis on reshaping industry structure. So that's a decentralization again. We're also seeing people being able to spin off new companies and grow them very, very rapidly with funding that exceeds the innovation funding in mature organizations. And so we read about that here in not just in Silicon Valley, but in other hubs as well. New companies we never heard of before, and suddenly they're raising, $50 million, $100 million, huge valuations, and they're able to do things that mature organizations just can't do. And what we also see is a transition from monolithic, long-lasting organizations to more networks of small organizations. And sometimes that comes out of the remnants of a large failed organization. So if you think of all the companies spun out of Nokia, all the ex-Nokia people who founded all kinds of interesting tech startups, they kind of have their own community and they can co-invest and collaborate and so on. And one of the things that we've seen also that we thought was pretty interesting was, shockingly on the government side, was DARPA setting up a scheme where you had maximum employee tenures. So instead of having you on as an employee and wanting you to last as long as possible, the arrangement is the opposite. So you basically have, say, 2 years, to make your mark, and that's it. So now, one thing I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail is higher order organizations. But essentially, the emphasis is shifting from just building new products, we believe, to thinking about how do you spin out new ventures. And they may stay within your organization, but building a new business is very different from just building a new product and fitting it into an existing business unit. Now, when people talk about change, everyone wants some sort of a model, some steps you can go through to effectuate the change. And so here's a sort of a straw man model. And we've distinguished here between adapting and transforming, because usually there is an intermediate stage where organizations are making some sort of immediate adjustments. A lot of organizations never get beyond that. But so let's see if we can utilize this model to talk about leadership development. So if you want to help executives develop more awareness, especially executives who don't have a technology background, who are not familiar with disruptive technologies, the first thing you have to do to give them an understanding is you have to put them through some type of an educational activity. And so you see quite a bit of activity on that front with executive teams going through workshops. We've done a number of board workshops and executive workshops to help them understand not just what the technologies are, but how they're helping reshape industries. And then once people have that understanding, then with some guidance internally or externally, they can start making technical changes in the businesses that they run. And so that's where you see really most of digital transformation happening initially. It's really digital modernization is how we view it. And really transforming the enterprise is a daunting task. Nobody likes doing organizational change. We spend a long time doing it with large organizations, and we understand why, because it uproots everything. And but it's unavoidable if you're going to be able to renew the organization more rapidly. You just have to re-engineer it as quickly as possible for change, for developing new businesses. And then as a leader, once you have the experience of transforming part of the business, you can now participate in creating awareness with other people, help other people grow. So, and this is kind of an executive, a manager development model, that fits in very well with lean thinking and lean leadership as well. And the leader as a teacher of others, assuming he or she has actually lived through the experience firsthand. Now, what we've also seen, and we've been fairly active in this, is try to use this model with cohorts. So if you have an executive team or a board, it's natural that they walk through the stage together, and so that's can actually be used to drive the changes that you want to make in the company. So it shouldn't just be about execution. It shouldn't just be education up front, and then you create a plan and you stick to the plan. It should be an ongoing process of really improving your understanding, and then gradually making changes. So all models, make compromises. All models are simplistic. I'm already, as I'm presenting this, I'm already finding ways to improve this particular illustration, because they don't all, the reality doesn't always fit with the model. Right? So you have to adapt to circumstances a little bit. Now, to dive into a bit more detail, so let me show you some steps that an organization can go through. So you still have some organizations that are pre-cloud, pre-app, pre-analytics. Maybe not a lot of large organizations still, but certainly plenty of mid-sized ones, plenty of family businesses around the world are on the very left end of the slide. Then you get digital transformation, which has become a big topic over the last few years. Mostly, it's really about modernizing the business people have, and then eventually it gets around to looking at developing new platforms and business models and so on. We should pause for a second and show some humility with respect to these large enterprises that are trying to transform. The amount of infrastructure that they have, the number of people that they have who have to be trained, the amount of stuff that has to get done just to embark on digital modernization, is fairly significant. And the transition to cloud, even though that started a few years ago, again, that initially it was very inward focused, creating a digital customer experience for a lot of companies. There's still so much work to be done in that area, and really starting to use design thinking and trying to make design part of the culture. It's a huge amount of work. So it's easy to criticize large companies for being bureaucratic and slow to change and so on, but it's hard work. Now, we believe that you have to go beyond digital transformation. So I'll talk a little bit more about what we think comes next. So if you're going to build new businesses, you have to think about how you compensate the people who are doing it. So if you compensate them as managers, or if you compensate them in the same way you compensate managers in running existing businesses, you're really kind of comparing apples to oranges there in terms of performance, in terms of judging people. And you have to also consider that the talent you're competing for is the kind of talent that could easily go off on their own with their friends and start their own startups. So what we think you have to do is to source entrepreneurs from the outside, and we call them exopreneurs, and basically compensate them as co-founders. So you have to give them stock or stock options, or you have to have some sort of a point system that can be converted into stock or converted into cash, so that they, at least compensation-wise, have a simulation of the compensation that they could get building their own companies. Yeah, and of course, you may not have to give them quite as much, because there's maybe more job security if you give them sort of a base salary there. But consider also that a lot of the folks that you would be sourcing from the outside are maybe people who don't need to work for a living anymore. So this is something I think that just large companies just haven't woken up to yet. Then what you want to have is a dedicated organization. And by the way, these organizations, we call them high order organizations. They don't have to be part of a big company. You can start a high order organization from scratch, and you can have a fund on the side. You raise LP money, you use it to build new companies. We're advising a company in London that's doing that. It's called Moonwalk, and there's some other examples as well. One fairly prominent one, which is not a client of ours, is Idea Lab in Pasadena, in Los Angeles, where Bill Gross, the founder, he sold the business to Yahoo just before the dot-com crash. So this is around the turn of the millennium. So he started with a $3 billion war chest. Okay, so it's kind of an extreme case. But he set up a lab close to Caltech, and they started building their own businesses, and they were spinning them out. And when they got to a certain level of maturity, they would get co-funding from Silicon Valley startups. So that's Idea Lab. And Moonwalk is the first one. So look those up. They're pretty interesting cases. And then what you want to do is you want to build portfolios of preferably disruptive businesses, just because they're going to become more valuable. When you start doing that systematically, that can become your engine for transformation of the entire business. So you want to think about divesting, legacy businesses that are maybe not worth transforming. So sell them off, maybe even shut them down, free up more resources for creating new, more profitable revenue sources. And what has to happen structurally to become sort of next generation of enterprise model, we believe, is to gradually change the business to consist of these self-renewing, self-organizing networks of teams. We think that AI is going to be fairly helpful for helping generate and maintain collaboration patterns between teams. A lot of tools and a lot of practices, that we've been teaching and using for the last few decades are being empowered by and if you will, eaten by software. That's certainly something that's happened. If you think about, things like peer reviews and quality management systems and so on. You cannot do any of those things today if you didn't have software tools. No one's using pen and paper for that stuff. Although we've been pretty nostalgic about Post-it notes, haven't we, for a while? But I think all of that stuff is becoming digital. Once you have a model for the information, you can build tools, and you can certainly also use AI to analyze industry patterns. We built a couple of models for looking at industries, both as networks and as layers. I'll talk more about the layer model shortly. And in order to be able to absorb knowledge and creative impressions from the outside, what you really want to have is a porous border. And there are companies that have done very well with secrecy, Apple and Disney and so on. But in general, most of the smartest people in the world don't work for you. And you want to make it easy to access them, and you want to make it easy for them to build relationships with your people. So having a porous border, I think, is going to be very essential. And then more likely than not, we're going to see more dispersed ownership and control. So as the enterprise becomes more decentralized, we think what's going to happen is you're going to have two levels of governance. So you're still going to have overall governance for the entire enterprise, the entire network, but you're also going to have governance on the micro-organization level as well. So that's kind of a sketch, I think, of where we see things going and what we're helping implement. Just a little bit more about higher order organization. So and how they might function. And how they seem to be functioning so far from what we've seen and what we helped implement. So we have a scanning function. And that's not entirely new exactly. We have different stages of development for ventures, and basically what you do is you manage a portfolio of ventures in development at different stages. So it's actually pretty straightforward. And then there's a people pipeline. There's a venture pipeline. And so you're attracting people from the outside, you're sourcing these entrepreneurs, and developing them for the purpose of helping build the companies. but there's no expectation necessarily that you're going to retain them. So they might stick around, help develop more ventures. They might exit with one of the ventures that they helped build, or they might just exit and move on to do their next thing. And I think this is a more realistic model from the perspective of how the younger generation likes to work anyway. No one wants to really be tied down. And if a large organization ties you down for too long, chances are you're missing out on a lot of exciting things happening elsewhere. So now the microorganizations themselves, we think are going to look like, and really do look like, sort of an expanded version of a development team. So you need to have a multidisciplinary team. You need to have business functions that are largely automated. And we think that people are going to be using smart contracts and distributed ledgers to tie the microorganizations together. Smart contracts still are in the early stage of development. And for those of us who have been around for a while, we know that smart contracts it's just a fancy term for business process management software, except that they run on top of distributed ledgers. And just like business process management software and workflow automations, generally, smart contracts can have bugs. And we still have the classic software engineering problem with the semantic gap between what we think the contract says, what the contract actually says, or what the code actually does. And that semantic gap actually exists with contracts that are in legalese today, where, let's say I, as a CEO, I sign a contract, I've read the contract, but I'm not a lawyer. And later on, we have some sort of conflict. And then my lawyer tells me, well, that contract, it doesn't actually say what you thought it said. Surprise, surprise. So I think as a result of this being so critical, there's going to be an increased interest in formal methods, which is my old background in software engineering. So people are going to start caring about, correctness proofs and so on, because otherwise it's going to be hard to really scale this reliably. And if you have a mistake, you're going to have to unwind transactions, and it's going to be sort of a mess. So, but I think this is kind of the new way of arranging teams, arranging work. And you'll find many of these patterns with sort of earlier stages of technology, maybe not smart contracts, but certainly APIs and certainly work queues between teams. They're doing knowledge work and so on. So it's more incremental and evolution than it might seem at first. A lot of these patterns have been there for a while, but there's an overall decentralization in progress in our culture, in our economy, that's continuing to push all of these trends forward. Now, when we look outside the organization, we built, as I mentioned, one model that looked at industries from a layering perspective. So that's called the value stack model. And that's essentially where we sorted business units or businesses by their how close to the physical manufacturing and construction layer they are. And so we identify these distinct layers, and we're able to see that the capital efficiency of firms that are further down in the value stack is lower. And very often the brand power is less because they're further removed from the end customer. The end customer maybe goes to a marketplace. That's where the customer has a chance to view options. That marketplace increasingly is becoming e-commerce now. And Amazon, of course, has a lot to do with that. So that's growing much, much faster than retail has been. And we see shopping malls even being shut down. And what we did with this model is we added a few years ago, we added another layer called the agent layer, because what we could see happening was that technologies like Amazon's Alexa was being used by end customers to get recommendations. And so what happens then is your brand power shifts goes higher up in the value stack. It shifts to the agent layer. And so if you have a customer facing brand, now your brand becomes an ingredient brand, and if you have an ingredient brand, your brand might become completely commoditized. And so what you want to do is you're developing new businesses is you want to think about how you can move your revenue sources, move your businesses generally up the value stack. So you shouldn't be developing new businesses further down the value stack if you can avoid it. Now that has fairly big implications for, let's say you are a $150 million German Mittelstand company, and traditionally you've been doing manufacturing and manual service, and now you're trying to come up with ideas for new companies. Maybe you have the next generation in the family business, next generation, the kids wanting to do startups, maybe on their own or within the family enterprise. You should not be starting more factories. You should be thinking about how do we create apps? How do we tie our products together with some sort of digital customer experience? Or how do we create marketplaces so we become the interface to the customer, or even agents? Although that technology has taken longer to mature than we have anticipated. We're still very bullish on that, but it's these interfaces are agent interfaces are still fairly primitive. So you can also use this perspective to look at how things are going to look at scale. So you can have microorganizations that are in very different geographical locations around the globe. They're tied together in a network. We refer to that as a value graph, and these structures can basically morph, over time. So there's kind of a digital analog here to how physical trading networks evolved, except that the changes in these structures can happen much more rapidly. So let's talk about the soft side, which is often the hardest side of organization design. So we have a model for this that we refer to as social architecture, and that basically consists of looking at the mindset of people in the organization and the professed values or ideals, and then the actual behaviors. Now, consider the generation that's now consists of 50% of the workforce, which is millennials, and then you have post-millennials, and then you have old people like me and older, so Generation X, kind of fading out in terms of the demographics. And what young people want in organizations and work today is they want to feel like they have an impact. They want to have the experience of self-actualization in work. It's not just showing up to get a paycheck. For them, it's an experience. And you can even think of how the job paradigm is sort of shifting to, we are subscribing to an experience. And if we don't like the experience, we'll go to some other company that can give us that experience, or we'll start our own. And contrast this with, the 50, 60 something executives who are expecting loyalty, focus on, results this week, this month, this quarter, and then they're looking for the long term, to create value. Everything moves kind of slowly. There's a hierarchy there you expect it to conform to. And there's the opposite of idealism, right? There's pragmatism. So never mind lofty ideals. We're just going to do what will work today. Don't give us any fancy abstractions. And that's pretty demotivating. And so if you're desiring to build an enterprise, evolve an enterprise to appeal to the younger generation, you should not just think about the structural remedies that I've talked about. You also want to think about what kind of an experience you want to create for the people who work in the company. You have to be a competitive service provider, if you will, as an employer. And that means you want to have a feeling of openness, open landscape, possibilities. You want to have leaders like, Richard Branson likes to talk about how he tries to say yes to everything. And I think this is a huge cultural, and leadership challenge for mature companies. As hard as it is to make these structural changes I talked about, the cultural changes, the leadership changes, really requires a change of heart and soul for the executives who are in charge. And I'm less optimistic about that. I think all of this is very possible, but the realist in me says, a lot of these companies will just die out because they're just too slow to change. So I'll end with a note here on leadership styles, just to get a little more technical, a little more detailed. So this is one of the models that we developed for looking at leadership behavior and effectiveness. It's a little bit hard to read on one slide, but essentially what you have is a scale. That's the horizontal axis here, and the vertical axis refers to different attributes. So you have normative. So how much do leaders use and appeal to organizational values? We should do it this way because that's what we stand for as an organization. Adaptability, means that leaders are emphasizing in order to persuade people, which is what leadership is about, persuading people to go in the same direction and to reach a shared goal. Adaptability is sort of appealing to the need to be agile, frankly, be flexible. How much do they use their own personal charisma to persuade people? How much do they rely on special insight into an industry or domain? So they have a lot of experience. And then there's two that should be familiar to anyone who's got any lean background: organizational change and individual growth. So how much do you emphasize that you are on a journey towards making the organization better and growing people as individuals? And then you have connecting the dots, integration. How much do you appeal to facts as opposed to feelings? So being evidence driven. And then autonomy is the upper two attributes here. What do people have the right to know, and what do they have the right to decide? So if we use that model, we can describe lean leadership as an approach that gives people a high degree of autonomy that's very much fact-oriented and growth-oriented for the organization and for people. Where charisma is something you don't really rely on. If you have it, that's great. But you're certainly appealing to values that you share, and you're certainly trying to show everyone and really be a model yourself for being adaptive, adapting to what the facts are, basically. Now, if you want to contrast this with what we think post-lean leadership is going to look like, I think we're going to see even more transparency, so more knowledge rights. I think what's going to happen is, because the microorganizations are so simple, there isn't a lot of focus on trying to change the organization. We're not doing manufacturing anymore. So our focus is really on the product that we're building. And the product and the organization is basically the same thing. So some people have remarked on how there's a similarity here to sort of microservices, basically. And sorry, I accidentally skipped over here. So and then I think we're going to see increased emphasis on adaptability as well, because the organization really is you. You're on the edge of the organization. You're basically a micro-organization in a network, and there's no one else telling you what to do most of the time. This is going to be more of a family than a huge hierarchy of teams. So I think everyone's going to have to become more multidisciplinary, and so that's kind of what we see emerging. This actually is not too unlike leadership styles you see in a lot of small startups, by the way. So no one in startups are paying that much attention to mentoring people for the long term, because just like in this scenario, employee tenures are pretty short. And that doesn't mean people don't care about growth. They just have to do it outside of the organization. And so they have their own growth journey that doesn't necessarily map to what the organization is doing. So you can find out a little bit more of this by subscribing to our newsletter. We are just in the process of rebranding this week from the Post-Lean Institute to the Post-Industrial Institute. And someone told me this morning there's a bug in the newsletter sign-up page. So maybe wait a few hours and go and sign up for the newsletter. This gets published a couple times a month, and it gives you a digest of everything that we learn, and also will tell you about events coming up in the Post-Industrial Forum as well. So we're almost out of time. I'm going to wrap up here to show my contact information, and then I can take any questions here in the chat. So. Or the Q&A, I guess. So if there's no questions, it's really embarrassing. So I see one person who's on camera. So you can think of something. Don't make me ashamed. You're muted, by the way. So now you're unmuted. Okay.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to take in. A lot of information. Don't really have a question. I'm just trying to think or imagine how things are. Maybe a question on the newsletter. So this newsletter is something. The purpose is to share. Let's say your learnings. You have an expectation on the newsletter. It's just something going out, or you want to develop a feedback group
or we have
community
a community called the Post-Industrial Forum. That's like a paid membership community. It's really aimed at investors, executives, and we have some founders also who are members, and policymakers. And it's a fairly new community. We really launched it just before the pandemic, so we were kind of, struck down by that. But we have, Estonia as a member, Japan as a member. So we have our first couple of country members, and we have had a lot of really interesting conversations in the events that we've held. So we had a launch event in London, in the city of London. Actually in the very building that houses the Corporation of London, which is pretty special. And then we had the launch here in Silicon Valley in January of last year. And that was here at SRI International. SRI is formerly the Stanford Research Institute, and they became independent a while back, changed their name. And so we have a special relationship with them. They're the anchor sponsor for the forum. And our Silicon Valley offices are actually on the SRI campus. So which is great for us because these are they helped invent the internet. The mouse, Siri. There's a lot of interesting technology that came out of here. So it's an inspiring place for us to be. So we're not just ivory tower management theorists. We actually in the middle of a world the technical stuff happens, and most of us also have some technical background as well. Like I said, I came out of theoretical computer science. Before I was fooled into starting down the path of organizational design. And that just happened because I was teaching software engineering, systems engineering best practices in large organizations. And then I realized that they couldn't do any of this stuff because they were too dysfunctional. So I had to help them. So the scope of my focus sort of expanded to if you can't do inspections because you have bad information architecture because nobody trusts each other. Right then, you're starting to address these multiple dimensions that go far outside of normal product development best practices. And the key reason why that stuff, all these best practices are usually such a failure in implementation is nobody does that. So you have to address all of these different dimensions. So there's in the fantasy world you can cut the Gordian knot with a sword. Old problems are gone. In the real world, you have to untangle the knot in these different dimensions. And as I mentioned in the earlier knowledge sharing session, there were 5 dimensions basically of organizational design that we identified. So one was the workflow, the value stream architecture. Then there's the explicit knowledge management. Tacit knowledge, of course, is in your head. but the knowledge you share and communicate is your information architecture. So the artifacts and the repositories and all of that. And then there's a product architecture, and that's something that's really driving, I think, workflow, and also driving the fourth dimension, organizational structure, organizational architecture, to a large extent now. And so again, Melvin Conway is an early person who made that observation, that there's a link between organizational architecture and product architecture, and then social architecture, which we just talked about a little bit. Now, the analog to Conway's law, by the way, exists on a supply chain level as well. So there's an Italian economist named Giovanni Dozzi, who did a PhD thesis at the University of Brighton, I think in 1983 in the UK. And I think he may have been Clayton Christensen's thesis advisor. I'm not entirely sure, but he made the observation that the topology of supply chain networks and product architectures basically mirrored one another. And so if you wanted to understand why the supply chain network of, say, a PC manufacturer looked the way it was, looked the way it looked, you could just look at, well, there's a box. Inside the box, there are a couple of other boxes, subsystems, right? You decompose those, and it all explodes into this dependency graph, which looks like a tree structure. And surprise, surprise, that is exactly what your supply chain network looks like. So I think all of that still applies, but the speed with which all of this is going to change is increasing rapidly, because more and more of the content is bits rather than atoms. And so the atoms part of manufacturing gets pushed to the edge, and then most of the links in the supply chain will be about transforming bits. And then the end station is where you put the bits. You take the bits and you print them into atoms, basically. And so we're just at the very, very early stage of this. That's why I tell people, just watch more science fiction. It's good for your or read more science fiction. It's good for your imagination. And we're still. You look at most organizations around there, they're trying to use quote unquote best practices isolated in small silos. And if you can't have this conversation with someone who's on the board of the company, you're just not going to get anywhere. And that's a disheartening message I have to agile folks. Like 15 years ago, is all this stuff is great, but they're never going to listen to you. So now what's happening is that everything's being reshaped to look more like corporate, old style central planning, and manufacturing, but that still doesn't fix the problem. It's because it's not manufacturing. It's knowledge work is fundamentally different. So we got to understand that the reason manufacturing production work looks the way it looks is that the structure of the work and the tasks is generated by what you are doing, the nature of the work, production work with those kinds of constraints and limitations and so on. And so that's Melvin Conway and Giovanni Dozzi teaching us that from two different perspectives. And what you can do in knowledge work is you have much more power of shaping the workflow by shaping the medium. The power is in the medium. But if the medium is hard constraint, then you organize the other dimensions to adapt to the medium, right? So that's why these processes look the way they look. But we sort of inherit these constraints from another domain, and then we try to make knowledge work look like manufacturing, which is ridiculous. And I was part of that for 10 years. So I mean, we did a lot of work to help people make aware of how these dimensions were interdependent, and how you have to address all 5 dimensions and so on. But I don't think we ever succeeded in sort of helping clients understand that look, if you start with the medium first, that dictates the answers to all of the other what you do in all the other dimensions. So we're at 7 minutes over time. I'm happy to hang out, but I know there are other sessions. Yeah. So
okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah. No, and you have my contact info, so feel free to write me for any
Thank you.
follow-up conversation. All right, I'm gonna sign off here.
Okay. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.